Good morning, and welcome to the Children's Services Mental Health Learning Series. This learning series provides free, helpful information and strategies for youth, their families, caregivers, and professionals who support youth with mental health issues. In this second year of the series, topics are devoted to mental health issues that impact youth. Human Services is committed to increasing staff and information for families, caregivers, and staff who support children and youth with mental health and addiction needs. Along with our partners in Alberta Health Services and Education, we are working to improve access to mental health services for kids, youth, and families, and to ensure quality services are available. As a group, anxiety disorders represent the most common of all mental illnesses. We know from Stats Canada Mental Health and Wellbeing Survey that young adults 15 to 24 years old have a high rate of anxiety disorders. The impact on those affected is profound and affects home, school, work, and social life. This can prevent many young people from reaching their full potential in our society. Joining us today is Jennifer Johnston, who is passionate about mental health issues that affect children, youth, and families. Due to Jennifer's personal experience with mental health issues, she is interested in making sure people get the right help at the right time. She has helped herself and others in her family to do just that. Jennifer will introduce our speakers and topics today. So, open your minds, open your ideas and your hearts, and we'll learn some things to help young people that are struggling. So welcome and enjoy the presentation. Jennifer.
Hi. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kelly Dean Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is director of the University of Calgary's Applied Psychological and Educational Services, or UCAPES, which is an on-campus clinic serving children and families in Calgary and area. Dr. Schwartz has been a registered psychologist for over 20 years. He will present Managing Children and Adolescents with Severe Anxiety, a toolbox of strategies. Part of the stigma associated with anxiety disorders can be the misconception that they are normal worry or concern. As a result, many youth impacted may hesitate to come forward with their concerns and are left to deal with them alone. Today's session will help us to understand anxiety disorders and discuss some practical strategies we can use to support children and youth dealing with anxiety. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Dean Schwartz.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Appreciate that warm introduction, and good to be with you folks here in Red Deer again. How are we all doing? Yeah, a frozen clap. That's great. Well, very good to be with you. Amy asked me before I got up, why do you have the name Dean in your name, Kelly Dean Schwartz? Well, I'm like, well, most famous people have three names, like Edgar Allan Poe and Henry David Thoreau and all, And she says, wasn't there a sausage named Jimmy Dean? And I'm like, well, yeah, I guess if you think Jimmy Dean Sausage is a 3-word name, that's, so I'm Kelly Dean Schwartz. It's all because when I travel in the U.S., Kelly is a female name, and I've made an attempt to masculinize myself, and it's never worked. So I don't know why I keep doing it, but anyways. Well, good to be with you this morning. We have got a full hour ahead of us, and even as I was sitting back there looking at our title for today, we've got a daunting task ahead of us. A lot of loaded words right in our title, managing severe anxiety issues in children and youth. And so what I want to do this morning is really threefold, so actually fourfold. I want to get through 2 points. I want to talk a little bit about understanding the difference between clinical and non-clinical expressions of anxiety. I want to talk a little bit about the patterns of interaction that go on in families that contribute. Then we're going to pause, and I want to take some questions and actually get us thinking. So in the room here and online, please already be thinking about some questions or comments or discussion points that we can have kind of midway through. And then we're going to talk a little bit more deeply about some of the family issues that are engaged with the expression of anxiety in children and youth. And then lastly, why you've all come here is to walk away with some strategies and some resource ideas that you can use immediately with children and youth. So we got a full morning ahead of us, and I'm looking forward to it. So as Jennifer was saying in her introduction, one of the things that we have to differentiate immediately in our work with children and youth, and as you heard, I'm privileged to direct an on-campus clinic at University of Calgary where we see about 160 families, 180 families a year that are either self-referred or referred to us by their physician and are served by graduate students who are in our two programs, counseling psychology and school and applied child psychology. When I started my role there as director in 2008, we oftentimes got, the bulk of our caseload would be having to do with learning disorders, some behavioral issues, school refusal, that sort of thing. In the last 7 years, which is a relatively short period of time, we have seen the number of referrals that come to us that have the word anxiety or worry or concern or physical, stomach aches, headaches, back. We've seen that triple, if not quadruple, just in the last 7 years. So I've been on a personal quest myself to deal with this first point, which is how do we determine what's just normal, what's just part of being a kid in the 21st century, and what do we need to be concerned about? So one of the things we do, and one of the things you do as workers, I'm sure, is you start to set up your own little system of categorizing and deciphering the behaviors and the symptoms and the things that you see, and we try to make sense of this in what's traditionally called the tripartite model or the tridimensional model. And we look at things like distress, how maladaptive is the response, and then also is there a physiological piece to this. And so one of the things we do, one of the things that we all do as clinicians and frontline workers is we try to establish very quickly and of course as accurately as we can how significant is the issue that the child is dealing with based on a couple of rule of thumb markers. Now, we know that left to their own devices, most mental health concerns have their beginnings or have their initial indicators prominent to us in childhood and adolescence. And of all the list of things that kids are dealing with in terms of their mental health concerns, anxiety issues, the family of anxiety, and we'll go quickly through all the different types of anxiety that kids can display, but anxiety is the most prominent DSM-5 category of disorders that kids deal with. Gets a little muddy here when you try to determine, well, what are we talking about? How prevalent of an issue? And depending on the resource, depending on how they've measured it, depending on whether they're just looking at kids that are actively undergoing treatment versus those that are still undiagnosed, you can get anywhere from 3 to 18%. Our best estimates are that it's probably 1 in 10 children who will at some point during their childhood or adolescence deal with a clinical form of an anxiety disorder. So as soon as I hear 1 in 10, I immediately go to a typical elementary school, 350 kids, and I go, wow, we're talking about 35 kids. We're talking about a classroom full of children within just a single elementary school who are likely to be experiencing significant anxiety issues. We know that this disorder doesn't treat kids fairly in terms of gender, and that in fact females are well overrepresented in both disclosing that they have fears and worries that are significant to their everyday functioning and that are causing them physiological concerns. And we know that females are more likely to be diagnosed and then hopefully seek and find treatment. But here's where our work as clinical psychologists gets difficult, because we have to then disentangle that from a lot of the other comorbid disorders that might be present. An ADHD, a mood disorder, sometimes oppositional defiance disorders, and then certainly when you get into adolescence, we start to mix in the difficulties in how it connects with their substance use, either prescribed or self-prescribed substance use. And so we have to disentangle that. We know that both the number and the intensity of the symptoms decrease with age, but we then also know that these just turn up in other places. We have kids that suffer significantly with self-esteem and identity issues, or we know that it's masked by other means in terms of whether or not they use substances to control that themselves, and so it's a very complicated issue. Every once in a while, a researcher like myself or a clinician comes across a slide that really makes us pause and think. This comes out of this slide comes out of some work that David Wilms did who's at University of New Brunswick, and was mining the National Longitudinal Study of Children and Youth. I think this is about the 2000 or 2002 data set. And this is really interesting for me, because as a clinician, and this is where when you get that number of, well, is it 3% or is it 18%, and how do we make sense of what that number actually means? When we look at kids that are under the age of 12, which we serve quite a bit in my clinical services, and I know you serve lots in your setting as well, you can see there's no gender differences at all between males and females. In fact, the slope is eerily similar. And a lot of times this is one of the ways we make sense of this is, up until age 12, most of our best rating scales or interview methods don't work that well with children. We go a lot by rating scales. Teachers, parents, significant others who are rating the behavioral symptoms of kids. So when that happens, you can see we don't see a lot of difference between males and females. Look what happens at about 10 and a half, 11 when we start to use our self-report measures for kids. This is now we give them rating scales, we do semi-structured interviews with kids. Now we see a significant difference. First of all, we almost see the number of kids self-reporting significant anxiety almost double, especially for females. And then you can see for males, it peaks at around that 10 and a half, 11, and actually declines or flattens out. But for females, it has a slow but rising increase in it. So when we're talking about prevalence of anxiety disorders in children and youth, we really need to know the age, we need to know the gender, and we need to know the method by which those symptoms are addressed or identified. And so whenever we get a past report, or whenever we get a psychologist report talking to us about a previous diagnosis, we're always very curious about, well, what age, obviously what gender, and then what method was it measured. So our first big question is, okay, having 3 kids myself, having had, in fact, having 3 teenagers right now, I'm myself trying to figure out, okay, what's normal and what's not normal? Because kids spaz out all the time, right? They overreact all the time. So when I, as a parent, am trying to, determine, okay, what do I need to be concerned about, and what is just, the day-to-day developmental trajectory of where my kids are at? You look at, I've just literally stole or wrote down 4 or 5 kind of situations or triggers for kids. Add your own list to this, in terms of all the daily things that kids are faced with that could be a trigger or a situation that causes a stress response. Then look at the behaviors in the middle. Again, everything from apprehension, nervousness, tensionness, edginess. Oh my goodness, anybody got teenagers in their household? Everybody's irritable. Everybody's, say the wrong thing about a shoe or a homework or bedtime or allowance, or why did you spend all your money on that? And all of a sudden you got World War IV happening. But you can also get some physiological. You can get the trembling. You can get the butterflies. You can get the nauseousness. You can get all that happening. And then, what we do is, or what I do as a parent, I just, and I tell most parents, is do a quick check. Is it transient? Does those moments of apprehension, nervousness, physiological responses, are they gone within minutes? And if they are, you're likely dealing with, again, more of a, just a nerve, it's just a stress response. We're not talking about an anxiety issue. Does it significantly interfere with the next hours or days of their life? Now again, with those of us that are parents know, yeah, kids can hold on to stuff and, they can't release it. But does it truly interfere? Do you see them pulling out of normal activities? Do you see them ceasing interaction with friends and family members? Do you see them changing what they do? Does it prevent them from achieving their goals? Do we see, a notable decrease in school performance, in athletic performance, in fine arts performance? Do we see some standard of their kind of regular behavior now underperforming? So again, in most cases, 90+% of cases, we have kids in our schools, in our classrooms, in our group homes, whatever, wherever we're working, we see kids come up against a trigger or a situation, we see a stress response to it, but then in 9 out of 10 cases, we probably see, even if it lingers for a bit and we get some attitude for hours or days afterwards, it still is outside that bounds of what we consider, or what we would consider, quote unquote, normal anxiety. So the question then becomes, well, when does these anxiety behaviors become a disorder? Or when do we move from this becoming a developmentally appropriate response to a situation and move it into when we might consider something clinical happening? Well, most of us, we use our anxiety to help us make good decisions, right? In fact, last night I was talking with Amy going, should I come down to Red Deer or come up from Calgary last night, or should I drive up this morning? Well, I used my anxiety to go, I'm going to hit traffic on Deerfoot, there's going to be a stall, there's going to be a truck in the ditch or something. So I used my anxiety to make the decision, that I did. And most of us do that every day. We use our triggers to say, this is the decision that I need to make to solve this. Okay, here's your first, this is worth the price of admission this morning, and I stole this quote, okay? Anxiety becomes a problem when it makes decisions for you. When your stress response, when your anxiety response dictates your next actions, your next thoughts, your next feelings, now you're moving from it just being a developmentally appropriate stress response to becoming an issue. When it interferes with your life, when it causes you distress. But I like that quote. I wish I could cite it. But when anxiety makes the decisions for you, that's when we've got an issue. And generally speaking, anxiety responses cause us to do two things. One is it causes us to misinterpret the threat, and it causes us to have an extreme response. And I use that term cause very intentionally, because a lot of times in research we use cause when we should be talking correlation or association. But anxiety, if it is a true clinical disorder, it is causing us to cognitively misinterpret some sort of stressor or trigger, and it's causing us to have an extreme response, either behaviorally, emotionally, or in many cases physiologically. We have a strong emotional response. Here's, this is going to be, don't try to read this. This is for you afterwards to look at in print, okay? Because I found this and it's a resource that I'll cite at the end. This comes out of Dr. Stan Kucher's work at Dalhousie University, and they've put together a beautiful package on dealing with, everything from diagnosis to medication to intervention on anxiety disorders. But in this figure table, if you could see it, on the left-hand side, again, there's a difference between being in distress and when that distress then becomes a disorder. And on the left-hand side, it's everything from, again, that transiency can be a positive factor in life, meaning all of us need a certain level of eustress. In fact, if you go back to all your intro psych, you remember that eustress diagram? We don't want to have too little, and we don't want to have too much stress. We want to have just enough so that our performance peaks we don't want to be understimulated, and we don't want to be overstimulated. Social supports usually help get us through. Medications usually are not necessary. Maybe we need a little coaching. Maybe we need just somebody to come up and pat us on the back and say, you can do this, and encouragement. That's when we're on the distress side. But again, that is very much a normal developmental response. Only when we start to use, again, that term disorder, are we talking about, that it's chronic and long-lasting, it's not transient. Professional intervention is sought out usually, either going to your GP or pediatrician, or to, if you can be lucky enough to get a referral to a psychologist or psychiatrist. May lead to long-term negative outcomes. So now you start talking about the comorbidities. You start talking about the comorbid mood issues, the self-esteem, the self-loathing, the social withdrawal. So now we start to see that this is not just about an immediate social event that's happening. So anyways, I'll let you look at that. But I'm trying to give you lots of info when you're working with kids and youth, to have something in your toolbox to go, is this just a developmental response that I should go, this kid just needs a little support, needs me checking in with them, for the next couple of weeks to make sure things are okay? Or is this something that I need to be concerned about as it, starts to predict negative future events? And again, use that term, when anxiety starts to make the decisions for that child, that's when we start to be concerned. So again, going to go through this really quickly. Because when we're talking about interventions, and we'll get to that, we need to consider, like everything else in our mental health, it includes at least these three components: the cognitive, the affective or emotional, and then the behavioral components. So let me walk through quickly. What are kids thinking so again, think ahead to already what you would do with kids in terms of intervention. Here's some help on, let's look at what are kids that are truly dealing with moderate to severe anxiety. What are they thinking? Well, one thing we know is that kids will often overestimate how likely it is that some unpleasant event is going to happen. We worked with a kid just 4 or 5 months ago, a little girl, age 6, who, whenever, and mom would have to pick her up after school, but as soon as mom was 2 or 3 minutes late, would leap to these real cognitive distortions. Something terrible has happened. The thought that it could be traffic, or that mom actually has a life outside of the daughter, or Starbucks lineup was a little long, nothing benign like that is thought. It's immediate that they overestimate the likelihood of something terrible happening. You and I know what that's like to sit across the table from a kid who's catastrophizing, right? They are just thinking the worst. There's no medium. It's just, no, she's dead. There's been an accident. Something's wrong. Or that friend is never going to talk to me again. They're never going to, and they go immediately to that extreme in terms of their thinking. They overestimate how bad the consequences would be if, in fact, an event does happen. So again, we had a child who had some real school presentation issues. I can't do this presentation because my classmates will think I'm dumb and laugh at me. So they attributed, again, what would be a normal trigger for us to say, oh man, I hope I don't bomb this presentation this morning in front of all these people, as a positive stressor. They go to, well, no, it's not if I bomb, it's when I bomb it, my friends are going to think this, and they're going to laugh at me, and they're going to change their views of me, and my relationships will be destroyed. Kids that are, again, when you talk about a difference between kids that are in distress in terms of their anxiety versus when that is more in the clinical range, kids are thinking the worst in terms of the consequences. Lastly, and this is probably where most of us live, they underestimate their ability to cope. You and I spend a lot of time trying to convince kids they have the resources to deal with this. They've got the social support. Their friends are not going to dump them. They're not going to, if they fail at that piano recital, that's not the end of their career. I've got a slide coming up here. I coached a little guy in Atom hockey 6 or 8 years ago, and would come off after a practice and go, my dad saw me miss the net on that shot. I am he's going to freak out. They immediately look ahead to the, and underestimate their ability to cope and go, that wasn't the best practice, but you know what, I'll tell Dad, I'll try harder next time. They don't recognize that ability to be able to self, cope and to implement their own coping strategies. So that's some examples in terms of underestimation and overestimation of what kids are thinking who have these anxiety issues. What are kids feeling? Anxious children and teens become pumped up. They get that, they get that nervous, it's kind of like when you're going on a big trip or whatever, you kind of have that nervous excitement. They have that going on all the time. Their RPMs are running high all the time. And they have this constant state of fight or flight response ready to enact. Now, again, for most of us, sat watching the news late last night and saw the guy on TV that got attacked by a cougar, and I'm just like, okay, that's the appropriate time for the fight or flight response, okay? We should run from a cougar, or at least we should outrun the person we're with to get away from the cougar, right? That's the appropriate response. For these kids, when they come up against, even minor or moderate stressors, their flight or fight response, like a cougar attack, kicks into that level. They are really on the edge in terms of their ability to cope with just the level of arousal they're feeling. So again, you can get all of the physiological things that go along with this. The racing heart, tense muscles, extremities feel cold, dry mouth, lightheaded dizziness. Again, things that you and I would feel whenever we have a quote-unquote true life or death experience. You know what it feels like? You've ever been driving down the highway and you have that, hit some black ice or tap on the brakes and all of a sudden you can't stop? You get that immediate, everything. All the glands kick in, all the hormones start to kick in. Well, imagine what that's like for, again, a child or a youth who's living at that level of arousal minutes or hours a day. That's their resting state, is that they have this incredible, over-arousal. They've got that fight or flight response. Okay, what do they think? How do they feel? Now what's the behavioral response? Well, again, I'm going to go through these quickly because you and I see these a lot. Behavioral indicators, we see the cry. Sometimes we see the crying responses, the shaking, that they just can't get control of literally their extremities. We see the avoidance behaviors, refusal to go to school, go somewhere alone, or they, again, the stomach ache happens, the headache, back pain, reassurance seeking. Well, am I, again, going back to this little girl we worked with, this was why the parents referred her. They were just tired of getting barraged by the questions. Well, what if we get lost on the way to the mall? Or what if the tire blows out on the way to the mall? Or, what if we get there and there's no parking? I mean, they would literally run through the list of all the bad things that could happen. And they need that reassurance giving all the time. But you and I both know that parents and caregivers, that can be tiring after a while, and you find out that strategy to just reassure all the time doesn't work. Sometimes you get the repetitive behavior. Sometimes you get into the obsessive or compulsive obsessive thoughts or the compulsive behaviors. We're not going to talk about that too much this morning about specific OCD behaviors, but when you see that, again, the behaviors themselves, as you know, are not the issue. The behaviors are preventing them and really allowing them to avoid the activities that they want to get into. So if they are, checking doors or checking binder to make sure they've got that, that paper in there, that permission form, and they have to check it 10 times, or that's the behavior itself is troubling, but it's not, the behavior is really just a way for them to avoid the anxiety-provoking situation that's really again, that stressor situation. So when we're still on that first question, trying to ask and answer, okay, how do we determine what an anxiety disorder is or isn't? Thankfully or unthankfully, we've got the DSM to help us. And so, and again, we're not going to go through all these, but DSM is really only helpful for kids and youth in particular in two of those disorders, separation anxiety and then the selective mutism. Everything else we kind of have to infer from adults and apply it to kids. We know that there are, though, a few anxiety disorders that are really common to children and youth. Separation anxiety, that's selective mutism. I said to you we've had a real rise in referrals to our clinic in the last, even 3 or 4 years. Lots in this generalized anxiety. Just the free-floating worry. Concern about future, concern about family, concern about environment, concern about schoolwork, pervasive what-if statements. Well, what if this happens, or what if that happens? Seeing lots of that. And then, of course, social phobias. We could do a whole session on social phobia, kids that are fearful of social connection. In fact, I've got to shamelessly self-promote. I think the next session I'm doing is on social media. Amy, I'm looking at you. I'm trying to make eye contact and get your attention. Am I not doing the next session on kind of social media and just, that's in April? Okay. So when we get to that session, we're going to talk a little bit about how kids' engagement with social media both helps and hurts kids that have social phobias. Because for some kids, it's a real lifesaver. They can have social connection without having the face-to-face. On the other hand, lots of negative outcomes of that because it's influencing their social skill development. Yeah. Okay, read this really quickly. Here's just a social or case example of social phobia. Key thing I've outlined there is that statement about now it's affecting daily functioning. So this is the direct quote of from an interview we did with a kid. Here's one for generalized anxiety disorder. And again, that's too long. I'm not going to wait for you to read all that. That'll be on the slides later. Key statement there is constant worry is taking over my life. This 16-year-old is saying to us, used to be able to handle this, used to be able to deal with it. Now the anxiety is dictating how she engages with her social experience. Other less common anxiety disorders, the phobias, the panic disorders. Again, the OCD, you can see we've seen over, since my 10 years director of the clinic, we've seen over 1,200 kids. I think we've actually diagnosed maybe 2 children with mild or moderate forms of OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder. It usually doesn't kick in until later in teen years, but again, we're seeing seems like we're seeing everything earlier, and everything we're seeing earlier is more severe than it was years ago. And then PTSD. Some of you work in situations where, kids have experienced either vicariously or real trauma, and of course now this is not a developmental issue. Kids are exposed to that, unfortunately, all the time, and of course, that's something we have to engage with. Okay, so what contributes to anxiety disorders? Couple of things and again, from a therapeutic intervention perspective, take a look at these when we get to, because I'm going to run through some screening measures and things that you can use. And really all the screening measures are doing is helping us get some of this history and some of this causal background. We know that parents that have a history of mental disorder and or the family has a history of suicide, we know that that's just a general yellow flag for mental health issues, but in particular, it has a strong connection to risk factors for kids for anxiety. The youth already has a childhood diagnosis of another mental disorder, a learning disorder, or again, the parent usually, or the teacher sometimes, has noted a marked change in that child's regular behavior. Here's where it's difficult for people like me and maybe you to come in, and we see kids for 6 or 8 hours. We do intensive one-on-one stuff. But in those 6 or 8 hours, we can't really assess whether or not there's been a marked change in that child's behavior. We rely really heavily on those who know the kid the best and try and give them the best kind of tools to determine whether or not there's been a change in that behavior. We know that anxiety runs in families. We know that there's a genetic biological component. Very common when we're doing parent interviews to find that at least one of the parents deals with their own anxiety issues. It may not be diagnosed. In fact, in many cases, it's undiagnosed. But they will tell you, yeah, I used to be that way as a kid, or yeah, I'm still that way, or I'm still... And I like this, again, stole this quote. Research has shown that what is passed on from a child is not a specific tendency to be shy or to worry, but a general personality type or a cognitive style. The way that parents model their own problem solving when they come up against stressful situations is really impactful on how that child then learns to deal with their own stressors. So part of the intervention, and it's for those of us that, and I'm trained as a school psychologist, so this becomes difficult for me, because we're targeted to work with the child. We oftentimes are not mandated to work with the family. But boy, successful intervention always has to involve looking at how the parent and child are interacting and that reciprocal relationship between parent and child. There's just no way around it, I don't think. Maybe unless you get into the adolescent years and the child is more independent, they're a little bit more autonomous in their decision making. But generally speaking, there's a link between that parent's interaction with their child and the cognitive style that they are using in their own lives to deal with stress that is really impacting on that child. So there's that parent reaction. So the reaction to the child or teen's behavior might play a role in increasing the anxiety. So we all know parents have personalities, thankfully. Like, we all have personalities. Some of them are excitable. Some of them are over-responsive. Some of them see every, missed parking spot or line up at Safeway as a major stressful event. And they model that to their kids, and that then becomes, the pattern that you see within the family system. And of course, you can have the stressor or traumatic life events as well. And sadly, we know that when we're dealing with kids that are dealing with a post-traumatic event, and maybe they're living in an experience where it's not post, it's just traumatic. It's just every day or every week there is a mild, moderate, or severe traumatic event. Your level of intervention and their need for intervention changes because, we often think that post-traumatic event means the event's happened, it's done, and now you're just dealing with it. But we know that some kids go home every day to a new, event of trauma. And so that's a very different response that we would have to those kids. We know that kids' temperament is a big contributor. We know that early on, if you held a baby in your arms as a parent and wondered, how did this happen? What do I do now? Now you get to know your kid too, and that child has a temperament. Maybe they're easy to soothe. Maybe they're a real difficult kid. Maybe they're a little slow to warm up, kind of the traditional temperamental styles. Well, that influences on, again, the intervention that we'll do that has success. Some of the neurological substrates that we see, some of these are hardwired in kids. And in many ways, some of the success that we've had with children and working with their anxiety issues is helping them come to terms and accept who they are, is just to say, what, this is just the way you are wired. You are one that, responds very emotionally to minor to moderate triggers. And let's get you some strategies to work with that. But sometimes it's getting them to come to terms with the fact that this is who they are, and they can deal with it. And it's, again, building on the coping strategies, even though some of this stuff may be temperamental and hardwired. Okay, keep going here. Here's one of the big ones, and again, we could do a whole session on this. In fact, I've put in a citation here. I encourage you to look up some work, it's over 10 years old now, by Brian Barber, in some work on what's called intrusive parenting. So I know we've got lots of parenting styles, lots of parenting strategies that all of us pick up on as parents to work, to manage our children. Intrusive parenting, though, is a style of parenting that is hyper-controlling and over-intentional in its ability to protect and save their child. And in many ways, but this is just beyond the protective helicopter type parent. This is a type of parenting that, as they see their child growing in autonomy and in, kind of their ability to make their own decisions, they clamp down even harder and use what Barber calls psychologically intrusive methods. They use guilt, they use shame, they use love withdrawal, they use threat, to say if you do that, mommy's not going to love you anymore, or mommy's, and they use incredibly strong language or tactics to control the child, and as a result, this changes the way the child approaches stressful situations because they think every time they come up against something, they're going to lose something. Something's going to be taken from them. That is very meaningful, not just an iPad or a TV show. It's a relationship or it's an attachment figure. And so parents, in their best attempts to hold on to their kids and to be vigilant parents, they slip into using these intrusive techniques. Paradoxically, so these parents who, and I've met lots of them, they have good intentions. These are not parents that seek out to psychologically harm their children. They're trying to do their best. But sadly, when you ask their kids about whether they see their parents as being warm and accepting, they will say that no, in all this smothering and over-controlling, I feel less connected to my parent than. So it actually has the paradoxical effect and actually can increase that child's anxiety response rather than decrease it. Now, having said all this, and because I know this is probably the literature I know the best in terms of its connection to anxiety rather than all the physiological and neurological literature, I want to point out that whenever we look at the effect sizes, so this is when we're actually looking for accounting for the amount of change in a child's anxiety based on the parenting strategy or parenting milieu that they've grown up in, it really only counts for about 20% and up to as much as maybe 40% of that, what contributes to that child's anxiety. So I say this to us as clinicians, and I'm always saying this to my graduate students. Families are important developmental contributors to their child. I mean, we know that in spades. But to point the finger at parents and say they're the reason for their kids' anxiety, either genetically, behaviorally, or in parenting style, the research just doesn't back that up. In fact, in our best studies, we can only account for parenting, and parenting styles can only account for about 40% of the anxiety expression in a child. So that's kind of releasing us to say, yeah, parents need to be involved in the therapeutic process and in the intervention, no question. This should be a family systems issue. But the parents should not entirely be implicated as the causal factor for that anxiety. So just keep that in mind, and maybe there's some questions about that or something. Okay, so risk factors, we've already gone through these. Family history, environmental stressors, trauma, that's a significant risk effect. Then some moderate ones are temperamental, history of family mental illness, having experienced a traumatic event, substance misuse or abuse. That's a risk factor, especially in adolescence. So kids who just say, oh, I'm just trying out, I'm just experimenting, I'm just playing around. Yeah, maybe for a few that's true. For others, this is their method of coping. This is their method of, that cigarette that they need 5 times a day is really in some ways kind of that compulsive behavior that helps them not to have to deal with the problem. It's not so all these behaviors have some sort of meaning. And then when you get into possible group identifiers, could be school failure or learning difficulties, some sort of social or cultural isolation. And again, for those of you that work in rural areas, this is where anxiety expression and an intervention for anxiety becomes really complicated, again, because of the resource issue. Okay. I'm going to let's take a 3-minute breath here. See if you've got any questions here. Amy, I'll see if you've got any questions online. Let's take a little point break here. Amy, you got one?
I'm having a hard time catching my breath with all the questions that are coming.
Okay.
So Jory asked, what can be done for youth with anxiety disorder who seem to have embraced a coping mechanism of getting very angry or irritated as a form of avoiding the anxiety? So as in, they would rather be angry than anxious.
Yep. So that's and in adolescence we see that a lot, where the emotional expression of it, so there's that emotional response of the tripartite model, the thinking, the emotions, and the behavior. That emotions piece takes prominence. One of the things that we're going to talk about at the end that's had a notable impact on that is helping the youth identify the stressor. Because oftentimes we can get so misguided by dealing with the anger and the emotion and think, well, if we can just calm the symptoms down, that's going to solve our problems. In many cases, it's building a trust relationship and developing a connection with this kid to the point where we can, alongside them, identify the actual stressor and then target that. And then we can deal with the emotional response, because it's not bad to have an emotional response to a stressor. In fact, that's common. The question is, how do we make that emotional stressor fit the actual trigger or situation or event? Any other one, Amy?
Yeah, this one is of interest to a few people online, and that is, what can be done for youth with comorbid issues such as autism or nonverbal learning disorder, who cognitively cannot seem to rationalize the toolbox strategies.
Yeah.
And so somebody else threw in, like, FASD as well.
Yeah. So when you get into disorders that particularly have a communicative aspect, like an autism or a nonverbal learning disability or a low-functioning child, this is very difficult. And in fact, in some ways, you have to then focus on the behavioral aspects of that, because that's where token economies, some sort of reward system, to get them to learn about, and we'll talk, one of the last strategies we're going to talk about this morning is a laddering technique. Getting them to face their fears, break it down into very simple pieces, and then institute a reward system for every time they respond appropriately to that stressor. Now, in many cases that means, and we'll talk about this later, but in many cases that means, boy, you have to break it down to bite-size pieces of the stressor, because it might be an overwhelming thing, like, school is the stressor. Well, how do we determine what part of school is actually the trigger or stressor, especially for low-functioning kids or kids that can't communicate that? Well, oftentimes that takes incredible patience to break it down in terms of a functional behavioral analysis. What part of their behavior is actually causing is the trigger, and then what reward can we institute? Because if you can't talk it through or rationalize it through, you have to use another method. Any question here in the room? Any thought? Don't be intimidated by those online people.
Well, I have more questions from the online people if there's no questions in the room.
Okay, let's take one more and then we'll move on.
All right. Would ongoing conflict between separated parents be considered constant trauma?
Ooh, there's a loaded one. One of the, if any of you have been, how many of you have been through Bruce Perry's stuff on trauma? One of the thousands of nuggets that he provides, one of the things I've heard him talk about is kids' perception of trauma, right? What one child considers to be traumatic, another child just considers to be daily life, and just, I have to deal with this. And so we sadly know, though, from the literature that that in some cases divorce or separation is not the worst thing that can happen to a child. It's the amount of conflict or disagreement that happens between the parents while that separation or divorce is happening. So, and that's, a simple answer to your question is, yeah, for some kids, that ongoing conflict between mom and dad could certainly be a trigger event for them and a traumatic event for them that could be causing an anxiety response. That's, again, where the family systems intervention has to kick in. And we've, in our clinic, we don't Because we're an assessment and diagnosis and consultation clinic, we don't tend to do lots of long-term stuff with families. But in families that come to us that are in the midst of separation or a fracturing, we will oftentimes pull the families aside and say, you know what, whatever disagreements and things you were having between you two, it's not that you need to shield your kids from the reality of it, but you need to shield them from the vitriol and the anger that goes along with that. Your kids need to see you actively and maybe loudly problem solving, but it shouldn't include threat or anger or fear of harm. And I think that's really, really key. Okay. Now we're into the what to do part of our, we'll try and get through this in the next 10 minutes and do some more questions. Okay, so what do we do if we feel like we've got a child that's at risk? What's our response? What's our plan when we think we've got a child that's beyond just being kind of in the distress level, and now we're moving into the disorder level? Well, one of the things we can do is educate about risk. And again, this is mostly educating the family, or if the teen is of age, you know, talk to them about risk. Talk to them about the factors that are contributing to their experience. No substitute for obtaining a good family history of mental disorder. And I'm surprised how many times I'll get referrals that have been seen by pediatricians and other professionals, and there won't be any history that's taken on, you know, whether or not this child comes from a, you know, either a cultural or a family background that could be risk-giving for them. Agree on a clinical review threshold, meaning decide with the parent or with the teacher or with the child what is acceptable to them in terms of a response to the stressor. Because many times the kids that we work with, nobody's ever asked them that. Like, when you freak out and have a temper tantrum in the middle of, you know, art class in your grade 3 classroom, do you think that's an acceptable response? Well, 9.9 out of 10 of them will go, no, I don't want that to happen. Okay, what do you think is an acceptable response to this situation? Get them to set the bar in terms of, you know, setting that goal in terms of their irritability. You know, how do you want to be? And then let's compare that with what you are doing, and let's try and close that gap as much as we can. Because oftentimes kids have a good sense of their behavioral response is not appropriate and is not functional. And in fact, it's kids that have social anxiety in particular who, you know, withdraw, don't go to parties, don't socialize with friends. They are distressed about that, and they know that that response isn't. So let's work with them on setting a threshold about, okay, you've got some social, you're just your temperament is shy, is kind of that socially withdrawn. But what's acceptable for you? Set that goal and keep revisiting what that threshold is. Arrange for a standing mental health checkup. Here's where, again, you know, easy for us to do this in terms of, this is a 10-minute once a week or once every 2 weeks type of thing. You know, check in on late arrivals, on tardiness, check in on grade fluctuation. You know, ask parents, how do their kids compare to other children of similar age in regards to this? And keep asking them about that. Keep asking parents about, what do they want for their children? What do they think is acceptable? And you might find that they have really extreme or, you know, unreasonable goals. And so you might have to work at paring those back a little bit. The goal is to try and bridge the ideal with the reality and try and keep that space coming together. Here's another thing that you won't be able to read. Don't try and read it. But this is a great, I pull this again out of Stan Kuchar's stuff. It's a one-page child functional assessment. And it basically says, the top, in the middle there, it says, over the last week, how have things been? At school, home, and with friends? Write down 2 things in your life that you either worry about the most or are causing you the most problem. Sometimes kids, when you just ask them that question, especially kids that have generalized anxiety, and we actually ask them, what's the 2 things? They realize there's really only 2 things that are bothering them. But they may be major things, but they think it's, you know, global, when in fact it's 2 very identifiable issues or people or settings or experiences or threats that then you've got a starting point. Okay? So this is a real quick way to do that. Write down the things about you that cause you or your parents to be concerned about, or that might concern them if they knew about these things. So getting kids to self-reflect, getting kids to take an other's perspective. Anxiety disorders are ruthless in getting kids to think ruthlessly about themselves. They are so harsh on themselves. When we can get them to reflect on what others are seeing in them and what both strengths and weaknesses, kids get a more reasonable sense of, again, their coping abilities and what they can handle. So this is a great little one-page functional assessment that's really helpful. Don't get nauseous. I'm just showing you, there's lots of screening tools for anxiety. Lots of them. That's going to be on the slide. Don't write them down. I'm going to show you, here's 3 that I use, that we use quite a bit. 2 of them are, and the best part is 2 of them are free. We use quite a bit the Spence Children's Anxiety Scale. It's an online measure. There's the website at the bottom there. We like this measure because it's relatively short, takes about 10 minutes to do. I like it because it's broken down, the norms for this are broken down for boys age 8 to 11, 12 to 15, girls the same, and there's online scoreable versions. So you can have this, kids like to do stuff on computers, so bring it up online, have them fill this out, takes them 10 minutes, gives them immediate feedback. I like it, there's a parent version and there's a preschool version. So this is an interview that you can do with a preschool child to quickly just get a sense of, now this is, I can't stress this enough, this is not a diagnostic tool. This is a complementary tool that we use with all the other data we're gathering. But for you that need maybe something quick and easy just to get a sense of, okay, what's the scope of issues, anxiety that kids are dealing with? This is a great one. Here's another free one that you can get. This is called we call this the Kid Skid, Structured Clinical Interview for DSM-4. I'm assuming that in the very near future it'll be upgraded to DSM-5. I'm not worried so much about the DSM alignment because we don't use this for diagnostic purposes. But this allows you to have a little semi-structured interview that you can do with kids and youth, okay? Because oftentimes when I sit down with kids and they're non-communicative or they grunt and groan in their responses, it's sometimes good to have a little bit of a script that you can use that asks some probing questions that get kids to think deeply rather than you have to come up with them. So it uses probing questions. During the last 6 months, will you say that you've been worried more days than not? When you're worrying this way, do you find that you can stop yourself? So it asks very behavioral questions. I sometimes find myself getting way too deep, way too soon. Why do you think you're anxious? What do you know? No, let's start off a little bit more topical and a little bit more, surface level. And then we can work our way down to causative factors. So that's a great one. Good free measure. The last one I'll show you is the mask. It's not free. It comes from MHS, which is a publisher in lots of mental health work. But again, we like it. 39 items. Looks at anxiety symptoms and dimensions. You might like it because look at some of the forms that are included here. Harm avoidance, social anxiety, physical symptoms, separation panic. I like that it has an inconsistency index, meaning you can get kids that are faking bad. You can kind of catch kids that are faking bad. The whole world's against me, but sometimes when they're filling out these scales, they'll actually, they're really falling into that overgeneralizing or overestimating their problems. It's not that expensive. I mean, for a school counselor or whatever, you can have this. I think they're $200, gets you the whole kit and 25 forms or something like that. So it's and MHS has some very good online, has an online resource center, so that if you buy the package, you can get access to not only this, but some other screening measures for autism spectrum, for communication disorders, a whole bunch of things like that. So this is the only one that I'm showing you that you have to pay for. Oh, I don't know why my thing went down there, but anyways. Okay, how do we help children? So a couple of things here. As a clinical psychologist, I'm all about the rule-outs. I'm all about trying to prove that the child doesn't have a DSM clinical disorder in anxiety. So I want to rule out as much as I can. So the first thing I want to do is have a physical examination to rule out. Maybe it's a medication reaction, maybe it's an allergy, maybe it's a heart issue. Have the physical, and I know in rural areas, again, that's easier said than done sometimes to get a good, clinical workup in terms of blood tests and making sure heart's good and making sure, but I want to know that. I want to know that what we're seeing is not based on a physiological issue that needs to be addressed by other means. Secondly, I want to have a full psychoed workup on a child. And again, I know that's idealistic, but I do that because I want to rule out that there's other issues that aren't at play here. I can't tell you the number of kids that we've had referred to us that have had learning disorder, that have had anxiety, worry, stress in the referral question, and we, do a psychoed and realize this kid has a specific learning disorder in reading. He's reading 2.5 to 3 grade levels below peers. It's never been identified. And this kid is just realizing that as his peers keep going up, he's staying down here, and that's causing stress and anxiety. So we want to rule out the impact of those other disorders, in particular some learning disorders. But you can see also that when we get into the social phobia range, we also know that spectrum disorders can be implicated in there. A couple more things we can do when we're working with kids is to test their anxious beliefs. So now again, this may be a child who's more on the mild, moderate range, doesn't have to necessarily be a full-blown severe anxiety disorder. We can work with kids to test their fears, to actually do some reality testing with them. And in fact, I even talk here about Rappi's work using the stepladder approach. I hope some of you are familiar with that. This is not rocket science. This is very simple, almost, cognitive behavior method. Get the child to write down their fear and worry list. And when it goes on to page 3, don't yourself show a panic disorder, wow, we got a lot of fears and worries here, a lot of things. Then you can pare back from that. Okay, let's go to your top 10. Okay, now let's go to your top 3. Okay, now you've got your place to actually start working. You may, though, I've had some therapists tell me, they'll get kids to make their top 10 worry list, and rather than starting with number 1, they'll start with number 10. Why? Because they'll work with the one that is still anxiety-provoking, but for which they can have the greatest success in overcoming. Then set up a manageable reward. Work with that kid. I worked with a child that had a selective mute issue years ago. Man, I worked with this kid for 8 months, twice a week. And as a school psychologist, that was almost unheard of, to devote that amount of time and attention. But we literally had to go back to, having this child whisper in her bedroom while the parent was in the room with her. I mean, we went right back to the basics and worked all the way up in 8 months to, I think the greatest success we had was that doing a classroom presentation, her peers were in one room and she was in another room talking into a microphone, and her peers could hear her in the classroom. But we had gone 100 miles from where we were to get to that success point. And it all happened because we significantly broke it down into these steps. And I would say to you, if you're not having success, one of the reasons might be is that the step or the step on the ladder is too big. You need to go to the next level down and break it down even more. But I encourage you to look up Rappi's work, lots of exhaustive support and intervention ideas there. Explore the parent reaction. I already talked a little bit about this. Anxiety, even though it may not have a parental or familial cause, it certainly has a family system connection to it. So work with that family. That whole notion of intrusive parenting, overprotectiveness, I encourage you to read Michael Unger's book called Too Safe for Their Own Good. How many of you have heard of that in the room? Okay, a couple of you, good. Really great book on The culture of parenting that we're in right now, that's about protecting and smothering, and because the world is a dangerous place, to Michael Unger saying, you know what, our kids need protected opportunities to fail, and they need them almost daily. They need to try stuff that you know they are going to fall flat on their face on. Why? Because that's the real world, and they need opportunities to do that in a safe place, and to learn coping, and to learn that they've still got support. Again, big part in there is having parents monitor their own anxious behavior. Have parents do a little checklist, or have them do that behavioral assessment and say, okay, what are the things you most worry about? Well, how does that connect with things that your kid worries about? See if you can draw some dotted lines between their behaviors in that way too. Some simple things like reducing stressors, practicing social skills, kids can cope better. We are privileged to work with a lot of families in Calgary whose kids are on the gifted spectrum, so these are the 130 plus IQs. But guess what? We know that about 30% of those kids deal with mild to moderate to severe anxiety issues. Sometimes we have to have heart-to-hearts with parents and say, you know what? I know that gifted program or that gifted school is a real good thing for a lot of kids, but for your kid, it's just not working. It's just not. We need to reduce a major stressor in your child's life. How about them going back to their school and being the star, and rather than being one of 500 stars at the gifted program? So sometimes we make difficult recommendations, whether they follow it or not, up to them. But sometimes we need to make major stressor reductions. Okay, we've only got a few minutes. I'm going to leave this slide up. For resources, I can't recommend to you more strongly a website. And if you knew my distaste for most websites, you'd know how painful it is for me to say that. The anxietybc.com website is absolutely money in the bank. For you, for parents, and mostly for the children and youth. They have spent, I don't know how much money, but developed a most stuff kids will say, well, that sucks or that's brutal. This is really creatively done, probably because they had it created by teens and by youth. It is really well done. The second thing I love, in fact, this is probably the first thing I love, is it's evidence-based. This is stuff that has been tested and tried and written up and peer-reviewed and retested. And so I can't recommend it highly enough. Again, I point you to Stan Kuchar's stuff on the bottom, Teen Mental Health. Again, a beautiful resource station for you to find material on. Actually, let me click ahead. Here's the front page to Anxiety BC. And so right from here, the kids get a sense that, okay, they're using my language, it's got a little bit of attitude to it, and it's got a whole bunch of stuff. And, in fact, they have a free app that we recommend probably to parents that have kids 10 or 11 and older. This is an app called MindShift that is on the Anxiety BC website. It's in iTunes and the Google store. Free download, helps kids monitor their behaviors, check in, helps them track their anxiety. Remember that threshold index I was talking about, getting kids to set it for themselves? This is a way for them to track it in seconds a day, that they can see how they're doing and get a visual of, boy, am I above or below where I set my threshold, and above or below where I want to be in terms of my behavior. So it's a beautiful little piece of technology, and I encourage you to maximize it. Okay, got some time for questions and comments. Again, love to hear one from us in the room. You can't just come and get a free breakfast and not fully participate. Any thoughts? Yeah, jump over to the mic here so that we can get it on here.
I'm just wondering with, I work in early childhood, so more in preschool settings,
Yep.
if you're starting to see more anxiety and if you're doing any sort of research in that area.
Yeah. So answer your first question is unequivocally yes. Like I said, even in 2007, when our clinic was just getting going, we were seeing, the typical adolescent anxiety, test anxiety, social anxiety, that sort of thing. Now we're seeing our mean age for referrals related to anxiety issues has, I would say, and this is anecdotally from our own clinic referral records, has dropped from about age 11 and a half, probably down to about 7 and a half. So that means if we're hearing about it when they're 7 and a half, it's showing up. It's starting to happen in preschool. So in fact, I have had occasion to work with Stan Kuchar's group. They're doing the school-based mental health program, I think, in some central Alberta communities, and I know across Alberta. They're doing it in the high school curriculums. I'm really lobbying, and maybe it's up to me to get it going, is to get it moved down into at least mid-elementary grades. But even as I say that, I know that we could even start to use it in our preschool and kindergarten, just to get the mental health language going and getting kids to know that how they feel physically also connects with how they feel mentally. Okay, any other questions? Amy?
I have some. What can you do when children are unable to identify their fear or worries, and they only say that they worry about everything?
Yeah. So that's a tough one, and again, I don't want to give you the illusion that mining down into an identifiable stressor or situation is easy. But when you get, like I said, when you get kids to list their fears and worries and anxieties, to get it out on paper, to have them journal it, to whatever, record it in some way, get them to physically look at it, even if that list has 78 items on it, you can go, well, okay, you don't have 100 here. The world is pretty complicated. Let's go through these and let's start paring these down, and let's start, because I don't guarantee you, but I promise you that in some way there's going to be some sub-themes that are working out here. Some will be related to family, some will be related to social experiences, some will be related to, public, test taking, presentation giving. So you can, if anything else, if you can get those clustered, that in and of itself will help the kid realize that, okay, it's not just an unmanageable, world of jello that I live in that I can't nail down. But in fact, no, I can literally get these identified and get these into chunks. Then you can start moving ahead and working forward. And maybe that stepladder approach is one of the things that you can do. Anything else, Amy?
So what is causing there to be higher rates of anxiety or more severe mental health issues in youth? Could it be higher rates of reporting these issues, or is it other reasons, like someone else asked, what is the impact of recent world events with terrorism upon the stress level of children and youth?
Yeah. I would like to think it's the first thing that you mentioned there, that we're just getting kids self-reporting, and we're getting teachers better at identifying, and we're getting parents better at identifying. I think, we do have, as you all know, we're in the field of mental health. Boy, we're at least getting it on the table, right? It's hard to go to a hockey game or to turn on the radio and somebody's not doing a mental health speaks or a hockey talks or a something to get us. So do I think that's helping? I think undoubtedly getting, and here's the one thing that I think is, personally, that I think is most critical, is that we start to treat mental health as firmly and strongly as we do physical health. And so do I think we're seeing that? For sure. I think, though, too, the social world of kids is more complicated. And again, we're in April or May, when we talk about social media, I guarantee you the presentation I have prepared now will not be the one that you hear from me in April or May, because the media world changes that quickly. Well, imagine, like for me, you know, if I can get my email and my texts a couple times a day, I'm all good, you know? That's because my social world is not connected to a piece of hardware or to a piece of software. But if your social world is, that is your lifeline, and you're not keeping up, or you're falling behind, or you are, you know, being left out, that is very anxiety producing for kids. And the amount of information we're expecting kids to keep up with these days is really daunting. You and I can kind of let it slide off because, you know, what is a 45-year-old or somewhere around there, person like me, I don't need to keep up. That's not my, I can slough it off. But if I'm 9 or 10 or 15 or 16, I can't not be engaged with that. And if I do, if I'm not engaged with it, that has its social consequences as well. So I think it's, I don't know that it's major world events. I think it's just the intensity of our culture at this time. And that's a cop-out, I know, but that's, I think you guys would identify with that in your schools and your classrooms, that kids are just, it's just being overwhelmed. So I understand, going back to your first question about the child who's can't pinpoint where their social anxiety or where their global anxiety is coming from, just because in some cases their anxiety is literally is multifaceted. And so some ways that we can help them is literally to list it out and get them to talk about specific things that they can control, and then get them to think like an adult and go, you know what, there's some things that we can't control, and help them to work through releasing that. Yeah.
There was a lot of talk on the webcast chat room about children who are unable to sleep alone, or without some type of help, like a night light being on, and we were talking as old as 14 years of age.
Right.
And some children who won't sleep without an adult with them as old as 14 years of age.
Right.
And so they're looking for strategies other than meds.
Yep. So my response to that is that we really have to work at this as a family systems issue now. This is no longer, because now the anxiety behavior is no longer just impacting the child, it's now impacting the family system, especially if we're talking about a child who can't sleep alone or needs a parent nearby. So that is where the approach to that has to be looking at that parental response to stress and anxiety, and giving that parent the power and ability to respond to their own stressors in such a way that it models for that child, here's what I do, and here's how I respond to it. And second thing I would say about that is, when you're dealing with security fears like that, or attachment fears, we're now talking about some of the most base emotional, biological connections that you can have, that, you know, according to attachment theorists. So there's no quick fix. B, it's a family system issue. And C, in many ways, the parent has to take the leadership role in this, in both addressing their own anxieties and modeling for their child their best methods of dealing with those anxieties. Then we can start to address the child's issues and work and literally have the parent and child, you know, comparing their ladders and going, how are we doing? How are we doing with our, you know, dealing with our behaviors? And but again, it's not going to be a quick fix. This is going to be a long-term strategy that we have to have. That's very interesting that you're getting lots of chatter on that, though, because I know that is a common problem we're hearing about.
And I'll need you to say what this acronym means, but does research support the use of EMDR for anxiety?
Yeah, so so that's a twofold question. One is, you know, the actual strategy of EMDR, which is a, you know, a desensitization type of strategy. When you get into, when there's an identifiable stressor, I think there is research to show that strategy works. When you're working with more the GAD, the generalized anxiety disorder, or the more general social phobias and things like that, I'd have to confess I don't know the literature on that piece. Then I think we're dealing more with, you know, again, getting kids to look at their own coping bank and what they have in that bank to cope, and matching that up with their again, their views of what they want their behavior to look like, and then trying to close that gap between the two of those. But honestly, that's to know the actual literature on that specific to, you know, anxiety in general, I'd have to dig some more into that to answer that question. Yeah.
Here's another acronym. How do you deal with GAD or GAD
Yeah.
in a female teenager or male teenager that particularly manifests in relation to stress? So for example, stress due to exams, because now it's crossing over into other areas of their life.
Yeah. So GAD is that generalized anxiety disorder, and it's the, again, clinically speaking, we work, whenever we're dealing with an anxiety referral, we tend to work hard to rule out that a GAD is present, because GAD is that free-floating worry and stress. So right in your question, you're saying, well, it's starting to bleed over into, you know, exam stress. That's, from a clinical perspective, that's actually good news to me, because now I've got a target behavior that I can actually work on with them and say, okay, we've got an identifiable issue here. You start to show all the anxiety responses when test time comes up. Now let's break that down. Let's look at the strategies that we can use. Let's look at the coping mechanisms you got available to you. Let's look at the rewards that are important that you will actually work towards to exhibit those behaviors. So to me, you know, the answer to that question is in the question, in the sense that take what you're given in terms of specific situations or stressors and use that as your leaping off point to work with a child, and then you can start to work on, you know, the free-floating anxiety worry piece by giving them success within one area of their development or one area of their experience. And maybe that's a way to kind of break into the GAD cycle. The GAD cycle, though, is not unlike mood disorders in that it often has all three of those components of the cognitive, the affective, and the behavioral, and it works in a real vicious cycle. So you've got to find some points within that triad to break into, and that's sometimes where behavior comes in. So in this case, if it's test anxiety or a test-taking situation, there's your spot to jump in on and work on that and find success with that.
All right, I got somebody who's now posted the question a couple of times because they really want this answered. How can you cope with youth whose anxiety is based on something that is not within their control, such as world peace, but we'll call that war, or parental situations, trauma, and abandonment that are a reality?
Right. What was the first line of that question? How can you cope?
It was, how can you cope with youth whose anxiety is based on something that's not within their control?
I mean, that's the first thing I thought I heard was, how can we cope, right? How do we as parents or caregivers cope with this? And I think, and that again is when you get into the ecological expressions or the triggers for anxiety, you know, like, you know, world hunger, world peace, environmental issues, things like that. That's a very difficult area because it doesn't necessarily have a behavior attached to it, and it doesn't. All it is very emotional and cognitive.
Actually, he apologizes and says, "Sorry, how can we best help the child?"
Okay. Well, I like the first part anyway. But then, you know, secondly, it's putting some boundaries around that expression. So, and we've worked, kids that are on the autism spectrum, you know how they'll get on a topic or a theme or an area, and parents will tell you, I can't, you know, the first hour I can talk about this, but when we're into hour 3, I'm done, you know. So oftentimes it's about the parents putting reasonable boundaries about that threshold again. I keep coming back to that threshold. Working with a child and saying, I understand your concern. This is so acknowledging that this is a concern, but then putting boundaries around it behaviorally, saying, we're going to talk about this, you know, we're going to talk about this for 10 minutes after dinner each night. It's going to have a start time and an end time. And let's You know, in each one of those, come to me with one single question you've got about the environment. Let's try to work it through. Let's try to come up with the pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, what we can do. But at the end of that 10 minutes, we're going to leave that discussion. Now, for the first week or month, there's probably going to be lots of anxiety about the fact that we put a 10-minute, and I'm just making up I mean, it could be that if it's 3 hours, maybe getting it down to an hour or 30 minutes is your goal. Whatever, set a goal, stick to it, realize there's going to be some pushback on that for the first weeks and months, but stick to it. Because I guarantee you the kid is likely also distressed about the fact that they're distressed about world peace and environmental issues and things like that. So let's give them some boundaries and say, this is our safe time to talk about it. Outside of this, we're not going to talk about it. And or to say, for the next half hour after this, you can read on it. You can go online and search up. Give them avenues, but put some boundaries around it. That might be very freeing for them because they know, phew, I only have to think about environmental issues for an hour today. Whew, that's a load off. I don't have to think about it going to sleep, waking up. This is my environmental box that I live in. So try that.
And our final question for the morning is, what suggestions could you provide for helping a child or youth succeed when there's no support from home? So, i.e. the parents' extended family.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that, I'm glad you asked that because that really bleeds into my research area, which is in the area of positive youth development and looking at the importance of other social supports in kids' lives. So this is where all the rest of us can come in. You know, school support counselors, teachers, mental health practitioners. You know, go back to my famous Bronfenbrenner statement. Every kid just needs to know that they got one adult that's crazy about them, right? And you don't have to be crazy about them 24/7, but the half an hour you're with them every 2 weeks, that kid needs to know that you have your ears open and you are, you know, are their adult peer. You're not a peer. They don't need a 40-year-old friend, right? They need an adult who's going to listen to them, give them direction, and provide support for them. And that's sadly a tough place to be. We work with some kids with Child and Family Services that are foster kids, and we've seen some incredible success stories of kids that have either reattached to their foster parents or found that, and or they found a mentor or a peer, an adult peer who comes alongside them. So the future is really bright for those, even though it's unfortunate they're missing that primary attachment caregiver. Are we all good? Yeah, come on.
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz. So thank you, Dr. Schwartz, for an action-packed, just over an hour and a half presentation on really practical, useful information I think we can all take away and use it and look up some of the resources that you've suggested. So thank you so much. I think we'll have another full room in April, I suspect, for your social media. Yeah. So thank you to our in-person and our web audience for taking the time to join us today. Our next session will be in Edmonton on March 9th with Dr. Bina Nair, who will present on concurrent disorders, treatment in Edmonton for children, youth, and their families. For our audience today in person, we will also be back in Red Deer on May 5th with Dr. Michael True, Alberta's Chief Addiction and Mental Health Officer, and he will be presenting on prevention, intervention, and postvention of suicide. Be sure to check out the website to register, and for those of you who registered today, please complete your evaluation form, and that will generate your certificate of attendance once you've emailed your completed evaluation. This session will be available online for those who'd like to listen to it and watch it again. There's also previous sessions to go to online under the Human Services website under Child Mental Health. So thank you again, and drive safely.